please.
Oh, stop it, Timothy. Enough. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, more, and for Dan, and for the booze. I'm not going to take over, but I did want to start.
Oh, you are actually.
No,
You're doing it already.
No, you'll thank me for this because Robbie was an ex-sound guy for SBS, right? And so when I was putting the microphone on for the online audience, I put it on the wrong lapel so it wouldn't listen. Or we wouldn't be able to hear it properly of the people who are online. And you told me a little story that you're going to share with everyone, putting on the spot. There was one, because you have to put your hand up through there, don't you?
Look, we're supposed to be talking about your book. But I used to work for SBS as a live sound producer, and so one of the jobs is putting on these microphones. And when you do that, usually with a guest, you hand it to them and you say, would you mind putting it up your shirt? And then up it comes through the top and then you attach it. That's the polite way to do it.
Yeah.
I did one very high profile guest came into the studio and I said, and I was really nervous because he was very high profile. And I said, would you mind putting that up your shirt? He said, I think you can do it for me. And that was David Attenborough, no less.
Isn't that amazing?
True story.
Did you touch his chest when
I touched his chest right up there.
Aren't we all just imagining your knuckles just hitting that hairy David Attenborough chest?
Yeah. It was simian in style. It was delightful. Now, is it beauty or is it beauty?
It's both. It's whatever you want it to be.
You know what? It's such a fantastic word, and it's a word that I use still a lot.
Yeah.
And is it still popular?
I have no idea.
Is it?
But I found it was an email reply when someone says, can you make, let's do 5 o'clock, and I just go, beauty. And then, I don't know, and people seem to like these sorts of books, and I suppose I don't write anything other than it's pretty much rooted in play. So when you have a book called Scorcher, I suppose, was that I wrote a few years ago, which sort of tapped into summer. And then clearly having a book called Chuckayui is only really going to work in this country. So yeah, there's something, beauty. I think it's such a great word.
It's a fantastic word and it's a lovely title, but it actually in many ways, and this is the power of it, it underplays the poignancy of the stories that are in this book. And I do want to, we'll get to the stories in a little while, but I do want to talk about the essential power of pathos in nostalgia, because your stories are sharp, they're bright, they're funny, but they have an undercurrent of pathos to them, which is what gives them such dimension, I think. And that concept, I don't want to get too highfalutin, but that concept of our nostalgia, of how we look at our past, of memory and how it plays tricks on us, and the inherent nature of aging and the pathos that comes with it, is kind of at the core of whatever you do.
I suppose the best way to talk about it is how over the years, the jokes that I've used to tell about my father and my mother as well, and over the years, they would soften.
Yeah.
And to the point where God, I was harsh on the old man. And my younger son, Bobby, was reading one of my books the other day, The Rumpus Room, and there's certainly chapters in there that he shouldn't be reading. He was just reading a chapter that I wrote about my house growing up, and I told a story about how my father found a pair of cut-off denim shorts by the side of the road, and he wore them with a rope for a belt for the next 15 years. And then the other day, and then I'm destroying my own argument here, but I would generally find that the things that I found myself feeling that I was being harsher on Dad at the older he got. I think becoming a parent and understanding a little bit of what your parents went through. I remember when I had my first son and I was like a blubbering mess, and I rang up my mother, I understand exactly everything you did for me, I got it that. And then it's very much the book and the stories in it are anchored in having lost both my parents in 2 years.
Yeah.
And they both had incredibly rich lives, lived into their 80s, and experiencing grief in different ways for both of them. And then finding that situation where you are suddenly it's you at the top of the table, and then your two brothers, and for me, it's my brothers and I wondering, oh, what happens to Christmas now? Okay, it's all, how do we rejig that family situation?
And I don't want to step on the stories about your parents in here, because that's, if you haven't read this, that's the delight for you to read. But what about the process of writing about grief and loss? Because you choose very specific moments in your memories of your parents to focus on in those stories. And is it cathartic?
Yeah, I think understanding the difference. My mother was one of those classic situations where she had a fall, ended up in ICU, never came out, and in one of the great sadnesses of all time, which is a really blight on how we design anything. You know, she died in a room without a window, which is just, I would have loved to have been, I wasn't there, I missed it, but why we can't just roll people outside, let the breeze hit you, let the sun hit your face for the last time.
We'll take that as a request for you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that would be really important. And Mum's grief hit me like a steam train, and Dad's was different. He had dementia, and he was in a home, and he was in there for, I don't know, post-COVID, and he was just a shell of himself, and it was the worst place as well. And sometimes I'd open the curtains, they put Channel 7 on full bore, and how many times I'd tell them not to. It was in Melbourne, and I didn't have as much control over it as I would have liked to, for a bunch of, convoluted family reasons. But I was saddened by his life. But every time I'd see him, it was another goodbye, and it was the longest goodbye. And writing about my parents in all sorts of ways has been cathartic, yes. It's also cleansed me of guilt of not living near them for a long period of time. And I suppose it's made me focus on those things that were really important to me about my relationship with my parents, and coming to terms, particularly with my father. And he wasn't always the greatest dad in the world, and in some way, I'm not necessarily always going to be the greatest dad in the world either.
Well, that's, you, me both. But he did get you a bicycle very early on. Yeah,
so...
Come on, let's rewind.
Yeah, so in the classic days when, there was a BMX craze going on, and I always say the 1980s ferry never really came to our house. and not, whether or not it was, like, we didn't get a VHS player until the late 1980s, I think, pretty much as I was leaving school. We only got a colour TV maybe in 1984, what's that, 8 years after they came in. We had to wait for the old Chrysler to actually stop working. We were changing channels with pliers in the end. And Mum didn't care because she only ever watched the ABC. And so it's like, well, what do I need that for? Well, I don't need to change the channel. But so when everyone was getting BMXs, Dad found some bike somewhere, and he I think it was a sort of girl's bike, maybe, but it didn't have the BMX crossbar. Maybe it wasn't even a dragster. It was just rubbish, but in order to jazz it up, he'd found an old license plate from somewhere, and he put that on the front to make it look like a motorbike for me. I was like, oh, thanks, Dad. And because in those days, they could burn everything, and I always call it the incinerators, and everyone had an incinerator. Dad didn't have, he had this section of the barbecue where he used to...
The old Besser brick ones.
Besser brick things. And he used to just burn everything. And I came home one day and he was trying to burn that old bike one day. But the worst one was my mother. So my mother was a GP, and she had this, she had a surgery opposite the hospital, and it was behind the railway track. And she had all this space at the back. And one of my jobs when I used to go there after school was to get rid of the medical waste for her. And so she had an old Neapolitan ice cream bucket where she'd chuck all the bandages and things and whatever, and all sorts of things. And then I would go down after school and then just chuck them into the Besser block and then just breathe in all the fumes, which was gearing me up for, smoking Peter Jackson 15s a few years later. But this is the strangest insight into my life. So I would be there and I'd be breathing in all these fumes, and and then I used to have these strange sort of fantasies because there was a railway crossing just near where I could see from the smoke going through.
Was there really, or were you just imagining?
No, there was definitely. And it was notorious for having accidents, right? And there was always huge accidents. And so I would fantasize that there would be an accident, and it would be a serious accident. No one would be killed, but it'd be serious enough for the eyewitness news to come, Channel 10 News. And I would be such a good eyewitness on the TV that they give me a job on Neighbours.
Yeah.
And that's how I thought it was going to happen.
You've had a pretty good career though, let's face it. That's where it started. Let's talk about the 80s for a little while, because a lot of your stories are rooted in that decade, and I say rooted advisedly. But it was a very different Australia to the era that we live in now, for lots of different reasons, and some of it was better and some of it was worse, and we're not trying to compare that. But it was a far more kind of, I guess, simplified experience. And what I do love about your stories is that you take us back, for those of us of a certain age who remember being in Australia in that time, and particularly in that suburban sensibility. The incinerator was just one aspect of it, but it was also kids getting on bikes and riding until it was dark or just before dark, and you had to be home at a certain time, but you could go anywhere. The hierarchy of who had, like you said, the best bikes, who got Tufts on their BMXs. I mean, I always wanted a chromoly frame for my BMX, but only had steel frame, So there's...
Well, at least you had a BMX.
Well, now I read yours, I feel very lucky, actually. But what is it, when you look back on the 80s, obviously we were there at a certain age group, and I guess that is the distinctive thing, but you were picking up this love for design and this appreciation for the world around you that has stuck with you for your life.
Yeah, I think there is something which I think about a lot more now, is that there was that sort of unbridled optimism at the time. And I spoke to Ken Doan about this, and he'll go, it was the time of World Series cricket, it was the time of the America's Cup, and it was... he says this great quote: "I'd been to Acapulco, I'd been to Portofino, and I knew that Australia was a stylish place, and people would walk around with a painting of the Sydney Opera House on their t-shirts." And he was right. But what he sort of taps into is that...
Yeah, what?
He taps into, well, more importantly, so those guys, right, and they're mostly men, but there were others like Olivia Newton-John, who were able to take Australian culture to the world, and they were the first generation who hadn't gone to war, so they were sort of felt invincible, and it was pre-globalisation, so things could exist here in isolation that were really interesting without being affected by globalisation in the same way. So culturally, it was pretty significant, arts-wise, music-wise. Things did happen in that way, and they just sort of felt like they could do anything, and that sort of filtered through up until things went.
Yeah, but what about for you? Because you not in this book, but elsewhere, you write about the beauty of some of the telephone box designs, and some of the things that we, if you grew up in Australia, took for absolute granted, but were actually really great design initiatives. Take us through a couple of those.
Well, I mean, I always like the story of the stack hat, it's because it tells a lot about who we are and our love of rules and regulations, and like this is the old story about it. There were two nations in the world where it's compulsory to wear a bike helmet, and it's us and the New Zealanders, and they only did it because we did it. That's it. That's just like, and I remember it vividly as a kid. They said, "Oh, you got to wear a stack hat now." And you go, "Oh, yeah, I look a bit like a dickhead, but no worries." Like everyone else would go, "No way." And we just accept that stuff because of because of the colonial part of our history was always about, if we had to keep a lid on things, the control, because if things went mad.
Well, we're in
exactly.
Here we are in the rum distillery. we could just about have a rum rebellion.
Yeah. So we're much more compliant than we really are. And there's a classic decor wine cooler, and it's the one that's got a white cylinder in the middle that you fill up with water, and you put in the freezer and you put 2 bottles of wine in it or whatever, and then you can, take it off to a Chinese restaurant and leave it there. And of course they were huge at the time, and people still use them, but they all happened because of our weird BYO laws, and because that up until not all that long ago, you couldn't get a glass of wine at a restaurant because the hotel associations have been so powerful in this country that they wanted you to go and buy a bottle of wine from the pub and take it to the Italian restaurant. And so therefore, that whole thing we had with that BYO culture, yes, we'd taken to picnics and all that sort of stuff. It really was for restaurants. But that particular one won the Prince Philip Design Award, and Prince Philip loved one. He took one back to Buckingham Palace. And it sits in the permanent collection in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Just because we're a nation of pissheads with weird laws.
Well, that's good too.
Yeah.
But there was also, what was the expo, the Canadian Expo? And again, this is not in this book, but it kind of gives us a bit of backstory about design, where we set up all these amazing installations and I guess it was a reflection of a country, and we're sort of pushing back the timeline here so that we can get to the 80s and then move along. But there was that sense of innovation that we've had as a country.
Yeah. So the time when we manufactured things here, we design things here, which we still do, but every day. I mean, that's that point of those things like the stacker. All those things were designed and manufactured here.
Yeah.
And so many of our everyday items were. And so in 1967 for Montreal for the World Expo, I suppose it was a time when Australian design really hit the world stage. Melbourne architect Robin Boyd, who wrote The Great Australian Ugliness, he was in charge of, he commissioned the whole thing. And Grant and Mary Featherston, the Melbourne designers, created these chairs called the talking chairs. And they you would sit in them, and they curved around, a very 1960s chair. Beautiful chairs, they still make them. But they had speakers in them on either side of them. They were sort of wing chairs. And when you sat down on them, they had a reel-to-reel tape deck, and if you sat down, it would make them push play, and there would be a red one and a blue one. One would be in English, one would be in French, and they would tell stories about Australia.
Yeah.
And there was hundreds of them, and they were a revelation. People loved them, and it wasn't many. I can't remember how many years it was, but before that, we didn't even have a pavilion at the World Expos. We would have a little table at the back of the British Pavilion, where there'd be some apples and some stuffed koalas. So that was it. And then there's this huge jump that came through, and at that time there was a sense of pride in what we could design and create, and you certainly see that with our automobiles.
Yeah. And let's take that point and then move it into culture, not just design. And because you have a lovely little chapter in here about sweet and sour, which
not the Chinese restaurant.
No.
Chinese dish. But
about the TV. Do people remember sweet and sour on ABC TV? If you're of a certain age, life can be sweet and sour. Yeah. But again, and I guess I'm always interested in this, having had a long career in places like the ABC and SBS, about. Now we are in a time of globalisation, of Netflix, of people sort of binge watching a lot of international television shows. The role of our own storytelling and where that's gone from the days of sweet and sour to now, and what the future holds for that.
Yeah, I think so. As a kid, I'd come home from school. I think it's 1984, 85 or something like that. And this particular show featured a whole bunch of guys who start playing in a band together. They move to the city, living in this warehouse. The band doesn't go so well, but it's got a soundtrack, and a whole bunch of famous people wrote the songs and sung them, including
Deb Conway.
And it was, as a kid in the suburbs, it was like a window into a magical world. Because it wasn't like the suburbs, it's the grunge of the inner city. And I, as a kid of the suburbs, the bush suburbs, the thing that I loved was being able to run around in the bush and the freedom of the bush, but that became isolating the older I get. Oh, I wanted this. And so I watched that show and I loved those songs, I loved the story, and I wanted to live that life. And I did. Like, I moved to the city and I played in some shitty bands.
Well, hang on a second, just stop there for a second, because you met up with Kid and Black Rose emerged. And you need to describe that just a little bit for those who have not witnessed the greatness that is Black Rose.
So yeah, I was living in a share house with my best mate Kit Worth, who I met at university, who I still do shows with today. He plays in a band called Rocket Science, and he plays in a Melbourne band called Spoonful, the institution, they're a blues band in Melbourne. And they were all in bands, and of course it's all sitting in the back of my head. I'd seen this TV show, and I didn't really think about it, but I want to be in a band. And I came home from university one day and I said, guess what, guys? I've entered us in the Battle of the Bands. We didn't have a band. And I said, oh, we're in it. We've got to start one now. And so with another friend who wasn't living with us, we put together this band, an Oz rock piss tape called Black Rose, and wrote a few songs. And we won our heat and then won the final, and then we started playing around town. And we played for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and you know, there was times we could fill some of those great pubs like the Punters Club in Melbourne, or started playing in the front bar of the Espy, which was huge. And then that's how I met Merrick. Merrick used to come and see my band.
So that's where your stand-up started?
Yeah, telling jokes on stage, and yeah. And I'd wear a Barnsley wig, wear tight Fabergé jeans, if you remember those, and a Barley singlet. It was fun, it was great. But going back to that point is that, yeah, like that was a template for, that told me that there was a potential that could happen. It didn't feel out of reach. It was different to, say, being a kid and watching, like, Midnight Oil play on the telly, that
Goat Island.
Goat Island thing, and watching Rob Hurst. And then you fast forward to being in my 20s, working with you, and Rob comes into the studio. I didn't imagine that could happen. But I could imagine that I could play, you know, and have fun in the inner city.
No, well, you wouldn't have imagined that you'd work with me.
No. No.
Yeah, Timmy and I first started working together about 25 years ago.
Yeah,
about 25 years ago. And this is not in the book either, but it should be. But one of the jobs that we used to, actually maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah, no, do it.
One of the jobs that we used to do was to go to regional areas for Unearthed, which was a really fantastic initiative. And this sort of ties into this whole conversation about what the role of the ABC is and stuff. But it was taking the radio station to the people in those regional areas, and it was giving them access to the airwaves, and it was meeting some of the local folk and the distinctive characters and all that kind of stuff. Merrick and Rosso and I went to initially Bathurst, and I think at Bathurst I seem to remember somebody turning up with a miniature pony in the back of a Valiant, and Merrick put a Triple J t-shirt on the pony.
Yes, on the pony, that was big.
Was good. Yeah. But then the next stop was Orange, and we stayed at the Canobolas Hotel in Orange. And we had done the afternoon's broadcasting, and we were kind of celebrating. And so in the bottom of the Canobolas Hotel is a nightclub, and we thought it would be pretty fun to go out to the nightclub. And so we had a few drinks at the nightclub, and I'm not a big guy, but I don't like authority very much. And I had a little bit of a run-in with one of the bouncers downstairs, because he wasn't letting me take my drink from the bar next to the nightclub into the nightclub, even though it was the same venue. And so I was standing 1 foot on one side of the entrance to the nightclub and 1 foot inside, and drinking in front of him. Suffice to say, that didn't go down extremely well, and I was kicked out. I was pretty okay to be kicked out. I thought, I've been a dick, I'm going to get kicked out. But the great thing about Timmy Ross is that he's a very loyal friend. And so maybe you'd like to pick up the story here, Timothy. Can you remember what happened?
I can't.
Okay. So I'll tell you what happened.
Yeah, no, please do.
So we ended up in Timmy's room, which is on the 3rd floor, and we had been eating some roast chicken that was fairly generally eaten. And out the front was a parked a Tirana, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then these 3 massive guys walk out of the front of the hotel and start getting into this Tirana. And Timmy's like, "Oh, there they are. Quick, give me the dirty bird." Like, "Don't do it." And he picks up the half-eaten roast chicken and throws it, and it was a perfect shot, smack bang onto the centre of the roof of the Tirana, just as they'd gotten in. And we just saw enough of the doors flinging open and them jumping out. Meanwhile, we sort of jumped back. And they were looking for ages. And I thought, if they actually find us, we're dead.
Oh, yeah.
But they never did. So thank you.
Oh, God, I thought there was the version that Merrick tells where I put the quarter chicken and chips down the dunny.
No, that's what happened.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that one with everyone. You know,
That's
like
all right,
I was,
that's in the next edition.
Yeah, serious author here, and then who threw chicken at the Tirana.
Yeah.
But no, but I think to finish up with the not dreaming about throwing chickens at Tiranas, but that role that you do play with the ABC, and which we were lucky enough to do, and knew for a lot longer than I did with the radio, is where you broadcast to people and you go to places, and you meet incredible people, and it unites us in many ways. And that was the thing which I always thought about Sweet and Sour was, you know, it's a simple thing that public broadcasting should do. It's like, tell us who we are and who we could be.
Yeah.
And I don't think we do that enough. And I think we've forgotten how. I think in all in the race to say that we need to modernise, everything's fracturing, we need to do this, we do that. But the charter of the ABC should remain, and so
yeah.
And I think I think they can still make programs that can affect kids in the way that I did. 100%.
Yeah, I guess going back to an earlier point about the world being more complicated, though, and that's the challenge, isn't it? Because what the Australia of the 80s was simpler in lots of ways, and so it's kind of easier to hold a mirror up than it is than these days. I mean, I guess that's the other question for you about writing a book like this, is how you choose which parts of your life you're going to open up and make public and which ones you don't. I mean, do you end up writing a lot of little snippets and deciding whether it's got the meat on the bone?
Well, one of the good things is my wife never reads my books. And so I always say, if I want to keep something from her, I just write about it in a book. No, I tend to not. I don't write about my kids a lot as they've got older. I think because they get the shits up. There's a photo of them, but in the book. But I asked them if I could do that, and I'm really glad I'm not on breakfast radio now, where you have to mind your life in that way, because I'd be very uncomfortable to tell stories about the kids and stuff. Mm. But then again, you know, when your son's playing with a guy, one of his soccer mates is called Keanu. And if that soccer playing Keanu was on a bus with a bomb, he'd probably just be on his phone and do nothing about it. And they're the sort of things I probably talk. But I think one of the stories, a lot of the stories come from, I have a large mailing list, and I wrote stories for that.
Yeah.
And so some of them come in the book. And one of the things I like about that is it's something very old-fashioned about writing a story about something that's going on in my life, and then sending it off to 20,000 people, and most of them unsubscribing because it shoots them on a Wednesday morning. But it creates a intimacy and a connection between people that a post on Instagram won't.
Yeah.
And I think all of us, I think at some stage you've read a book that you've really liked and wanted to write a letter to the author and to say thank you for that, but you wouldn't necessarily go, I watched something I really like on TV, I want to write a letter to the director.
But for a lot of your stories, they are about these periods in your life that we all... I mean, and this is the beauty of reading a book like this, because it's impossible not to place yourself in those stories, whether it be writing around the suburbs or any of the other stories. But I guess the question is how reliant or how reliable is our memory, because it plays tricks on us.
All the time.
And so when you're writing about do you fact check any of this, or do you just go, this is the story, as far as I'm concerned, whether it's real or not, doesn't matter.
I'm a comedian, Robbie. That's never.
I thought so. Yeah.
No, never.
Well, I'm a very serious journalist.
No. I think it's more the visuals. Like, isn't it really interesting? I had this woman come to my show on the weekend when I was in Melbourne, and she was the mother of one of the girls I went to primary school with. And I said to her, she said, "I'm Lou," and I went, "Yeah, I remember you," and I remember the colours of her BMWs. I remember the house. I remember her exquisite good taste. I remember what she used to wear. I remember how she was beautiful, and still is a beautiful looking woman. And I remember how someone told her daughter in grade 3 that her mum was ugly, and she started crying. And I remember my grade 3 teacher going, "That's ridiculous. Your mother's the most beautiful woman I know." And so I think one of the things with design for me is that people always ask me about architecture. You know, what happened? Why did I fall in love with architecture and design? Is as a kid I noticed everything, and I think it's because I was the youngest. And in the suburbs, you've got bush, which I noticed, of course, and then you've got a new house that pops up. So in the space of the first 15 years of my life, we went from having koalas in the backyard and wallabies around until suddenly, you know, it's like a housing estate. And every one of those houses that popped up, I took notice of, and what went in them, and we'd go around to, there'd be open houses all the time, and there was ones, I remember vividly going to one, there was Merchant Builders, which was like a huge architect design project home company that made really interesting houses in that time. And I remember going to them as a kid and lighting furniture. I remember the lime lampshades, I remember the furniture they had in them. And I'm making a film about one of those houses for a show for next year. So it just sort of can't escape it. In the same way that music connects with people, or there's TV shows. But I think in some way that sort of comedian's mind where you look at everything and you mine stuff from material. Like when I finished doing breakfast radio, I remember going, I don't have to create stuff from this conversation here. I'm not looking at everything, looking for a story or a joke. Now I'm looking at things aesthetically and what they mean and what stories that they can tell.
And that question about how design can affect your mood or your outlook, as somebody who is very aware of the space around you, you know, what are your insights into how good design can make you feel a lot better, and how, you know, conversely bad design can do the opposite? I
mean, on those big, the worst ones are, you know, where schools are designed badly. I think it more about in terms of public spaces. You know, I was out at the new studios, the ABC in Parramatta, and it's beautiful. Like, you broadcast with a glass wall connection with people walking past. There's green space there, but on the other side of it, you've got offices with no windows. Like, that doesn't work for anyone. Everything's new in them. But every time I go to any sort of office building, I don't care how nice the chairs are and whatever, they're sort of grim places to work because you can't open the windows, and I don't think we're designed to do that. But like, you can look at the folly of things. One of my favourite ones was, I was filming at this, it was a high-rise school, you know, there's more and more high-rise schools going up. And for many of us, it's really challenging because, you know, like, it's not what the school's supposed to be. School's supposed to have this huge oval, it's got to have this and this, it's got to have some sort of tree that these days kids aren't allowed to play in, or that, you know, all that sort of, you know, they're not even allowed to have tan bark anymore, or whatever it is, because all sorts of reasons. But so the idea of a high-rise school in an inner city, it's like, oh. And I've been to some that are really good. And when their teaching method's progressive that goes with it, it is really good. But I was looking at this particular one in Melbourne, in the Docklands, and the Docklands down there is a mess anyway. But they got rid of doors that you open at the school, so everything's got to be environmentally sound, which makes sense. But so one of the reasons they do that is having doors that motion sensors. And so to go into your schoolroom, you walk up and it opens up like you're in a shopping centre. No, that doesn't really feel right. And then they put one in the playground, going on to where the women work in the office, who aren't always the friendliest people and sometimes hate children. And so every time the kids run past, the door opens. Middle of Arctic winter. Like, that's the worst design I've ever seen. But I think, I suppose I think more about how can the ideas of great houses excite and enable great life? How can the smallest things in a house, like whether it's just a window that looks at a tree, or how you create a different space within a smaller place. And I'm quite buoyed by how things are going, and this is an example of it. So I've got this exhibition coming up as part of this new live show for the Great Australian Dream. So I've been combing through here at the State Library of New South Wales 60, 70 years worth of archives and looking at different stories to tell. And of course, you're looking at a positive story, and a lot of the stories about apartments seem to be about doom and gloom. Everyone goes, oh, for every Opal Tower at Homebush, there's a bunch of apartments who are really good. And when I was at Coldplay the other night, you're going, God, if I lived there, I would never have to buy a ticket, you know? It's like... But as you watch the trees go up, that green space works, time has caught up with it, you know, you go, this is actually a pleasant place to live, this makes sense. But we've got this photographer to go and take some photos of a whole bunch of apartments in Zetland and all around those new areas apartments have come up. They're the most beautiful photos, and they speak of an optimism for the future. They're really quite extraordinary. And they're lovely couples sitting around an apartment, house of pride, using the public spaces, using the shared pools, all that sort of stuff. And they do sit, and there's this beautiful shot of this kid looking out a window of his bedroom, and there's this huge hole next to him where they're building another apartment block. And it's not grim, and it's no different to other photos that I could show you from the 1960s and 70s, where someone's built a house in St Ives and there's nothing else there. And it's all battle scarred because they're building out, you know, someone wants to build a house next door. It's just a different evolution in how we live in the Australian dream. And so we've been really lucky in this state that many of those new apartments, yeah, everyone talks about the shit ones, but lots of really good ones designed by really good people. And they've been really thoughtful about it. And people are living a better life. I was in Melbourne the other day and Fitzroy where I used to play, and I'm staying in this hotel opposite the Punters Club, and they've reopened it, and I'm really excited about that. And the streets have changed, and buildings like this have become apartments. They've got, and they jot straight onto the street like this. It's not like there's no green space, there's no setback, and part of us goes, oh, that's no good, we don't want that, but it works perfectly. You're right connected with the street. There's so much going on, and it's better than when it was when I was living in shitty terrace houses there in the 90s. So it's not doom and gloom by any stretch of the imagination, and I think what those broader things we do are enabling a better life.
Well, that is a very optimistic point at which to pause this conversation, I think, Tim Ross. And perhaps throw out the questions to the audience. Does anybody have any questions for Tim? Yes, good.
Statements. Oh, I love this. Actually,
I want to do it.
You can just.
You have to.
You can hand down the. They can punch the mic.
Did I tell you I did sound for SBS?
Yeah,
it's actually quite important.
Yeah. Later on, you can touch the hand that. touch the knuckles
David Attenborough.
Touch the chest of David Attenborough.
That sounds very appealing. Thank you for the discussion. Very enlightening. I'm an architect by profession, and you, sir, have done more for architectural discourse in this country than any architect, living or dead, since Robin Boyd.
Oh, there you go.
How do you feel about that?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you.
You're breathing a sigh of relief on that one, aren't you? Because I'm an architect and you're a phony.
Yeah, you're going to say, what are you talking about? I think, I wrestled into something that I was really passionate about, and I think a lot of, I don't know. It's very kind of you to say. I'm very humbled by that, but lots of people have been very kind to me over this journey of the last 12, 13 years, and I've listened and I've learned a lot, and people have been very forgiving when I haven't known things, and and I've probably tried not to overstep when I haven't known things and been someone who knows a little bit. But I'm not a professional by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know much about building, but I know a little bit about how we want to live. And I've met so many interesting people. I've been into so many great buildings that have just, made my heart sore, and the people that have lived in them. So yeah, I feel really blessed to have I've had a really fulfilling second act. My third act's probably going to be as a ceramicist, and it's not going to be as successful. I'll tell you that right now. But if you want a pinch pot, come and see me in 12 years' time.
All right, another question. Well, I must say, aren't you a lively bunch? Oh, Kathy, go on.
Oh, well, I'm not an architect, but I'm a nostalgist.
Yeah.
That's a word. I like your talk about nostalgia, about your parents. So I'm kind of interested in not the design part of your story, but the beauty and the history of your parents, and what do you feel about their presence in your life, and as you pursue your life, how do you feel they kind of influence you?
Oh, it's a really good question. My dad was an amateur performer, and so I used to see him perform in plays when I was a kid, and that was huge. And Dad was an extrovert, I'm not, and so Dad was really funny, and was the life of the party. And when I was a kid, the next door neighbours had a housewarming, and I was much younger. It was a costume party, and Dad went as a magician, and he was doing magic tricks. But he had the best thing ever. So he was walking around with this deck of cards, and he'd go, pick a card, any card, and then don't show me it. And then he'd go, is it the 4 of clubs? And they'd go, yeah, how did you know? And then he'd go, pick a card, any card, is it the 4 of clubs? And he had a deck, and they were all the 4 of clubs. And so that's part of it. And then my father, later on, he was a pharmacist and became an antiques dealer, and he was obsessive about sort of the history of things, and he was a junkie for that. And so I think that the collector side of me, and because I collected furniture for years and still do to a certain point, but my house is full, and I don't need any more stuff, and I also like to stay married by not coming home with a couch that we don't need. But I did buy one the other day that I put in storage, but that's another story. So that sort of being interested in the provenance of things, and I think in the history, what I do is history, social history most of the time, and that's what I did at university. And I did theatre and drama and history, and then the history part of it I sort of pushed to the side. And weirdly enough, I'm using that more over the last 10 years than any other time in my life. So yeah. And my mother, my God, my mother was the most kind and generous soul. And the story that I wrote about her in the book, which I just love. So she worked hard, and she was the major breadwinner when I was a kid. She started up some of the first women's refuges in Victoria, where she worked pro bono for years. And she's a good doctor, and people really liked her. And she was the only female doctor. She put most of the girls that my brothers went to high school with on the pill in those times. Because that otherwise you'd go to some creepy male doctor and be asked those sorts of questions. So she had a successful business because of that. Not just because of that, because she was because women wanted to go and see female doctors, and she delivered hundreds and hundreds of babies. And you'd be in the supermarket with her one day, and there'd be someone who was there, and she'd deliver that person, and she'd also deliver their daughter. And that was more extraordinary than anything I'd ever done, by any stretch of the imagination. But my favourite story about my mum was that we had this woman, Mrs. Evans, who looked after us when we were kids. She used to help out. She babysat us when we were really young. And then when my brothers moved out, I was by myself at home. And I think my mum realised that after school I didn't need to be looked after, but I think she sort of thought I was getting lonely. And so she organised for Mrs. Evans to come and do the ironing after I'd come home from school. She didn't need to be at that time. She could have come at any time. And we used to sit there and talk about sport and whatever was going on. She was a wonderful conversationalist. and she and I got on better with her than my grandmother in some ways. And then she got sick, and she was in ICU, and my mother dealt with a lot of death, and you would often not see her. She would never really, not much would sort of knock her around. She was pretty bulletproof. She was fierce in lots of ways. But she was very, very fond of Vi. We all were. I loved her. And she was dying. And my mother went in there, and all these specialists had put her on all these drugs. And Mum overruled them and told them to take them off, all of them. And she pulled through, and she lived for another 10 years. And in many ways, I always thought that was like the greatest gift Mum ever did for me. So I had more time with that beautiful woman who was so important to me. So I think, like, when she died, in her undies drawer, there was a letter I wrote to her, and which was just, there wasn't, "Dear Mum, I hope to see you soon. There hasn't been a time in my life where I haven't been proud of you." And it was nice that she kept that next to her socks and her jobs. But it rings true clearly for me. So.
Yeah. And the other family member that's probably worth a very quick mention is your Uncle Jim. Yeah, who's in the book too. And because when you decided that you were going to head off in a career of stand-up comedy, it's probably fair to say that most family members would have gone, "You're an idiot." But what happened?
Yeah, Jim, he lives up the road actually. I'm seeing him on Friday. I love him because he's like my favourite uncle. I don't know many of them left, but he's my favourite. But he's a dentist and Vietnam vet, and he just said, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I think you'd be great at it." And you don't need much. And my father was less supportive in that way, and I could only unpack it by the fact that he had a better understanding of what it took to do it, and I think he was worried about me failing. Whereas Jim just said, you just go for it. And I just to have that one older voice in your head, someone that you love and admire, to say, "Yeah, I reckon you could do it," was extraordinary for me.
And he was right.
Not about the ceramicist.
All right, do we have any more questions for Tim Ross here? Yes, I can bring that one down over there. Look at this.
I wasn't expecting any questions.
Well, I can ask you a few more if you like.
I was in New Zealand and they said, "Oh, look, do you want to try to do questions?" I was doing a talk and they go, "Oh no, they won't ask any questions." They're too...
You need to, I'm going to pass it over to you. Sorry. Thanks, Kathy.
Just interested if you had a group of, let's say, first year architecture students and you wanted to take them to places to show how we can live in a better way, in a better community, where would you take them?
There's a Urambi village in Canberra that's in one of my series, Designing a Legacy, and it's a cooperative housing scheme, very 1970s, brown bricks, nestled into the bush. But Michael Dysart, Sydney architect, still with this lovely guy, it just has this very simple premise. It's like, well, what happens if you get some land and you all put some money in, and instead of the profit going to developers, that profit goes back into what you get. So that's really good for a first point. So you get better amenity, you get better designed houses, you're in charge of what you get, but more is the style of them, which I really like, and they're basically cluster houses, so you get less personal space in terms of garden space for yourself, but there's so much communal green space that you don't care. And so this particular one's got a pool, it's got and there's, I can't remember, I think there's 76 varying degrees of townhouses, houses all on this development. And instead of the road going through it, there's a central path. The central spine is a pathway because you park your cars on the outside. I think that's like an ideal way to live, but trying to get you couldn't get a developer to go anywhere near that because You know, you can't get them to do anything at the moment because they don't want. They're holding. You know, they talk about this. This is the worst thing. You talk about why we can't get more housing. Is because the developers are waiting for the interest rates to come down before they start building, so they can make more money. So they're creating their own land banking, creating their own design because they can still make a dollar, but they'll just or because there's a failure, a supreme failure to successive governments, both state and federal. This state government's doing a little bit better to create more social housing for everyone, so we wouldn't be in this mess. Most of the developers looking, where's the best way we can make money from apartments? It's not for affordable housing, it's for downsizers apartments we can charge a lot more for people. So they're not really interested in affordable housing, and nor should they be. And we wouldn't be in this mess at all if they did what most governments all around the world do, particularly in New South Wales, is create more social housing. When we talk about, when we talk about social housing, it's not for the classic cliched houses that the Daily Telegraph love sticking the boot into. We're talking about affordable housing or social housing for nurses, teachers, policemen, so they're not on public transport or in the car for an hour and a half to look after our kids. I certainly know from my school we lost one of the teachers because they didn't want to drive 2 hours a day to come to Middle Cove from wherever. So yeah, huge issue.
Big issue. Small book, big issues.
Yeah.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. Beauty is the title of the new book for Tim Ross. Isn't he a delight? Can you please put your hands together and thank
you,
Timmy Ross.
Robbie Buck, ladies and gentlemen.